Are you a business owner looking to grow your business in South Africa? Tune in to the Blaze Podcast with Telkom Business. Learn from the experts and get tips on marketing, finance, innovation, and more. Blaze with Telkom Business.
Welcome to another episode of the Telkom Business Blaze Podcast. I'm Bulelani Balabala, your host for today. We have a special treat lined up for you. In this episode, we are flipping the script. Our usual host, Mashudu, will be in the hot seat as we'll delve into the fascinating business of podcasting. Mashudu has been at the forefront of driving engaging conversations and insightful discussions on this podcast. But today we're going to uncover the strategies, challenges, and successes that power the real Mash startup. From creative process to the technical aspects and everything in between, we'll explore what it takes to make this podcast a must-listen in the digital age. So sit back and join us as we take a look inside the world of podcasting from the perspective of someone who lives and breathes it. Let's get started. Welcome, Mash.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Maybe let's get started by unpacking. Let's talk a bit about your podcast. Maybe just unpack that for us.
Yeah, so I started my podcast around 2016, really out of a need to solve a problem, which is, I think, the motivation for most people that want to start or build things, is you look out into the world and you see what's available and you decide that, there needs to be something else, right? So, I was watching a lot of interviews, listening to a lot of different entrepreneurs tell their story on traditional media, whether it was TV, radio, newspapers even. And it was amazing to see their stories being documented. But what I really always wanted to hear was the process behind it, right? What was the actual process of starting, building, and growing your own business? What does that look like from a practical sense, right? Like when you go onto traditional media, what you'd usually hear is the victory lap, right? So how much they were winning, how successful they were, how great their growth was. But no one was going, okay, but what did that take? What was the process to getting there? So my podcast started out from just being able to want that, which was like, can we solve meaningful problems by helping people that want to start and build businesses, be able to learn from the practical learnings of those entrepreneurs and small businesses so that the next generation of people that want to start or grow businesses can go into it, from an honest perspective. I understand what this takes because I've learned from another entrepreneur who's explained the process, the difficulty, the failures, the challenges, but also just like how much more you will need to grow as a person in order to be a great entrepreneur. So that was the beginning.
Sure, what a beautiful start, eh? But just on the back of that, right, what inspired you to start and when did you start?
Yeah, so this was back in 2016, and at the time I was just interning for a really amazing entrepreneur community called the Hookup Dinner, which was a great institution for entrepreneurs and small businesses. And my boss at the time, Selebogo, he was like, hey, I was invited to something, in Soweto. It's a meetup for creators and people who are entrepreneurial with some guys from Facebook. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll take it. When you're an intern and you're just starting out, you want to take every opportunity. So I got there and, it was really casual and really good to learn from other people. And one of the people I was sitting next to was in the Facebook marketing team for Africa specifically. But they were from America. And they were like, how do you guys document the journeys of entrepreneurs in your country? I was like, what do you mean by that? She said, are you guys doing an honest job of helping entrepreneurs and small businesses learn from people that have done it before? And what tools are you guys using to do that? I was like, oh no, we don't really do that, right? We like to tell the good stuff because the difficult stuff is very hard to take, right? And she was like, you should listen to a podcast. I was like, what is that? And she's like, oh no, do you have an iPhone? I said, yes, I do. And she said, you should open the Purple app. I was like, oh no, I deleted that because I didn't have memory, right? And that's like one of the first things you delete because it's like, I don't need this. But what I didn't realize is that there was a world inside that app that just opened up a whole lot of information, knowledge, and just like a world of communities where you could connect with people that were building things and people that were growing things in a very, very meaningful way. And one of the podcasts that I listened to there was called Startup, right? And it's an American podcast. And I encourage anyone that wants to start or build a business to listen to this podcast because it was the most honest version of a entrepreneur's journey that I've ever heard. And it's this guy who's trying to start a podcast business, and he recorded everything. He recorded his first pitch. He's recorded his conversations with his wife about them running out of money to be able to build this business. He recorded conversations with his partner to decide the equity split. So this is like a very, very, very like broken down experience of what entrepreneurship actually is. And that was the inspiration, you know. But on the other side was just this really insatiable, you know, hunger and desire to be able to tell South African stories about entrepreneurship and small business and what that actually looked like, how creators were actually building things that they cared about and stuff like that. That was really the beginning for me.
No, thank you so much for that, man. And also, I think I love how you sort of unpack the desire to tell true and authentic stories, right? But, you know, podcasting has become very popular. Why do you think that is in this day and age?
Yeah, I think, you know, originally podcasts were very niche and very focused mainly on building communities, right? So what it was about at the beginning was, can we find people that care about the things that we want to talk about? And it was very personal and very one-on-one, where people started podcasts for small communities of people that cared about specific things. You know, for example, you know, a fly fishing podcast, or like a podcast about football, but specific types of football, or how football is played in different ways. So it was very niche in that way. But I think video has completely shifted that medium to becoming more popular, a lot more dominant as well. So what that opened up was, it wasn't just audio experiences, but now it became video, and it had that visual element. And I think that's really exploded things over the last couple of years, where people can now access those conversations that used to be for very small communities, and now they became, you know, much broader and bigger, you know, conversations that people wanted to be part of as well.
And I mean, can you walk us through a typical process of creating a podcast?
Yeah, so, you know, I've created multiple podcasts because, you know, I started my podcast on its own and wanted to tell entrepreneurship stories. I realized you could do this for other sort of topics, other sort of communities as well. So I started a podcast network specifically to try and get other people that want to tell really great stories to come in and be able to do the same. And that process looks like identifying very deeply who the community you're building for is. And I think of that very similarly to building a business. You know, you always want to know that there's someone out there that needs this thing that you're creating. And then you're trying to solve a very meaningful problem, whether it's access to information about a certain topic, or being able to drive conversation around something so you can document and advance that sort of topic in some other way as well. And then really creating a safe space for people who are interested and deeply committed to that thing to be able to do it. So for me, definitely starting with, you know, the community, right? So if I find a really great community that needs a really great podcast, or a place that they can come together on, that's where I start my podcast from, right? So I recently built a podcast called The Ecosystem by Mashudu, which was mainly just a podcast about, you know, the ecosystem players in South Africa. So all the people that could help you start or grow your business, where are those people? Who are they? What do they care about? How do they help you build your business? How can you find them? What resources do they offer? All of this became the foundations of it. So I was thinking, you know, there is no clear documenting of the South African ecosystem. So that's the problem I wanted to solve. The community I was building this for is entrepreneurs and small businesses who don't have access to information and are very early in their entrepreneurship journey and want to find those people in the right ways. And then the last thing, again, create a safe space. I think those conversations were very honest, very raw, and very detailed to help someone be able to go, okay, I've now listened to this and consumed this content. I can take this as a practical thing and be able to take actions for my business, take actions for myself in my creative or entrepreneurial journey.
And I mean, you know, you raise very important things. And I mean, I love the journey that you took us through around how you built this podcast, what community it serves, right? But equally to that, you know, a critical component to this is the guests that actually come on. How do you select or find guests, and what topics? How do you select topics as well?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm deeply, you know, infected with the virus of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And like all my topics are always going to be around entrepreneurship, small business, and the creatives, right? And so it really starts with making sure that there's a a critical challenge, I think, in the journey of an entrepreneur that needs to be solved by this guest specifically. And this guest having, very clear knowledge about this subject matter and them having, some level of investment in being honest, right? I think the biggest differentiator between traditional media and podcasts is the honesty and the rawness that it allows you to be able to go, you know what, we don't have a 15-minute limit on our time here. We have an hour. Break down this thing from the very bare bones so that when someone leaves this podcast, they fully understand this topic. I think recently, I did a podcast around, branding and marketing for businesses. And it really was about forming the foundations for how an entrepreneur and small business can actually think about those things very deeply and really be able to take practical tools, take those things and be able to implement them in their business, right? So it really comes down to the honesty of the guest, the knowledge that guest is able to impart, but also how honest and clear they can be in the process of teaching this to the other person and how effective that can be and practical it can be for someone to actually implement when they go away from the podcast itself.
Yeah, and then, when you sort of then look at everything that you've mentioned now, you might find someone sitting there thinking to themselves, does podcasting make money? What are the primary revenue streams for a podcaster?
Like when I started, definitely not, right? Like I started at the bottom and it was really about adoption. Oh, wow. And there's a lot more adoption now than there was back then. And I think with the adoption, with the audiences, with the communities that have started to grow, what's happened is there's a lot more options, right? And it will always come down to the traditional revenue and monetization that internet businesses have, right? So sponsorship, which is very direct, a brand comes to you and says, we love the community you're building, we love the content that you're putting out there, the information you're going out there with. Can we, buy in just to be able to say, for example, this podcast is sponsored by Telkom, for example, right? Yeah. That would be a traditional sponsorship. And then secondly is more like very direct marketing, right? So a brand says to you, we're trying to sell, whatever it is, card machines, for example. Can you be able to put a promo code in your podcast, for example? So you will have noticed if you listen to any podcast, they'll say something like, this podcast is sponsored by X. Use the offer code X in order to sign up and you can get this device on a discount. That discount obviously leads to them also getting some cut from each sale that they make, right? And then obviously, then we go into the more community-based monetization methods. So for example, selling subscriptions. So Apple Podcasts has now opened up where you can actually sell subscriptions to your podcast to be able to charge a certain fee for your customers or the people that are listening to be able to access the exclusive content or be able to access the podcast much earlier than the usual audience. And then there's other platforms as well, YouTube and Patreon, where you can do sort of more, specialized content for the people that subscribe to you, and they get a lot more content and stuff like that. The last one is very traditional stuff where it's like you can sell T-shirts or merchandise of the actual podcasts for people to be able to buy in, right? So whether you're selling T-shirts, the traditional T-shirts, hoodies, stuff like that, or you can go even further, selling beverages or so much more.
And I love that, right? Because a great part of what you're mentioning touches on community, because that audience is your community. Yeah. So how do you refine your audience, right? And create relatable content for your audience?
Yeah, I think the moment you think you know who's listening to your podcast is the moment you definitely have lost them, right? So there is a journey to learn who the people that you're creating this podcast for. And very early on, you can try and define that for yourself, right? So for me, it's always been entrepreneurs, small businesses, and creators who are very early in their journey or in the middle of their journey. And what they're looking for is information to navigate what it takes to grow through that journey, understand the processes that other entrepreneurs have put in place in order to make their businesses much stronger, much more structured, have a lot more systems in place to be able to run what they're doing. And then the last sort of level of that is like people that are looking to partner with the right people in order to scale and get to the next level. So once you've defined that, and I can define that at the beginning, it evolves, right? So where the people are when they listen to your podcast for the first time versus where they will be in 2 years is a different place. And someone, will only meet your podcast in 2 years when you've done 100 episodes or whatever it is, but they're still coming in as a new audience member. And then you have to redefine that through the conversation that you have. I think the biggest mistake I've seen a lot of podcasters or media platforms make is make it a very one-way communication where you're sort of talking at your audience. And that's very traditional media thinking. I think we have a responsibility to talk to our audience on a consistent basis, have that conversation constantly, and see and understand who these people are, what they need, and how you can serve them better. And it's really about like the content that you make, but the community that you're building and how you try and reach those people so that you can make sure that you're still being very, very impactful throughout that journey that they're going through.
And I mean, can a person turn a podcast into a business?
Yeah, I've attempted to do that, right? And got burnt sometimes. I think that it's really about the type of business that you're trying to build. If you're trying to build a really big media business, I think that is still very much something we're still growing into. You've seen a lot of creators start a podcast, be able to grow that to a significant number of audiences, but then switch to traditional media because they can be able to reach a lot more people. So as a traditional, as a media business, it's still developing, right? And you've seen some successes where really great audiences can be built by a podcaster, and they implementing all 4 of those monetization strategies in order to build something of a media company, right? There's also a different aspect of this business, which is more technical, where you're just offering podcast recording services. So there's definitely different types of businesses that you can build in this area. It's really about the focus that you have and where you really want to drive the most impact. And as a media business, I think it's still developing whether or not it can be sustainable, even though there are some, really great signs of outliers. And unfortunately, they are outliers, right? So for the most part, most people are making podcasts to serve communities and doing it as a labor of love. And eventually, if they build enough of an audience, they can grow to that size. And I think it's just about thinking very differently about how you're building this business and what type of business you actually want to build.
And I mean, what role do you think audience engagement plays in the success of a podcast?
So, community being at the center of podcasts since the very beginning means that without that sort of engagement, that conversation, that consistent back and forth, your podcast actually loses its core energy when you don't have that conversation, right? So if you're not speaking to your audience, you're not communicating with them, you're not making it clear, here's why we're taking this direction, here's what we're going to do next, here's how the podcast will evolve. Those things are so important because it's community-based. And as soon as you are, a trusted member of society to build a community like that, you have a responsibility to ensure that you take that community on a journey with you, right? So this is not your podcast. This is a podcast that you started, but you definitely need the community to drive what that growth looks like, what that evolution looks like, and what that journey looks like. So it's definitely, for me, I think the conversation is a critical element because without that conversation and back and forth and the engagement, then you lose the sense of community that makes the podcast really great. And without that, it's very difficult to see how you can, be wildly successful.
And I mean, just on the back of that, right, because the importance of the audience and how they drive the growth of a podcast. I mean, how do you think an audience can support, I think from a monetary perspective, right, the growth of a podcast, and how do they get involved in financially supporting podcasters to grow, or even podcast themselves to actually grow financially?
Yeah, so I think it's definitely nuanced, especially in our country, right? Not a lot of people can afford to just pay for a subscription every month. But I definitely think if you care about the community that's being built around the podcast that you listen to, it is your responsibility to try and help it move forward. And even if it's non-monetary support, and what that looks like is listening to the podcast, sharing it as much as possible with the people you know it can impact, and really helping it, grow online. I think that is non-monetary support, where you're really just driving the growth as someone who really cares about the community that's being built. And then from a monetary perspective, I mean, we spoke about those four different
Yeah.
monetizations. Two of them are really focused on the community, right? So if you have the means and you are able to, definitely subscribe to the podcast, pay the subscription fee, support them as much as possible in terms of those things. And then, you know, I forgot to mention one type of monetization, which is eventing, right? So with eventing, you open up a whole new, level of monetization for your podcast, because what that enables is your community can directly interact with you, but also with each other. And I think that's what you really want to be able to do. So I think when the podcast puts up an event and they say, we're doing, a meetup, we're doing a live recording, we're doing something special for our community, definitely attend. So attend the events, pay the subscription, buy the merch. And I think if you only have so many means, definitely start with the cheapest, which would probably be buying the merch as much as possible. And then, paying for the subscription, attending the events, and then again, those non-monetary ones where you can just support the podcast to grow.
And I mean, how important is the quality of the content in building and maintaining an audience?
Yeah, so, a lot of what we've spoken about is community, right? And with community comes expectations. And once you set a certain bar in terms of quality, it is important to be able to uphold that bar. Right. And I think we're living in an age now where you've got one world where a platform like TikTok doesn't necessarily ask for too much in terms of quality, but they still care about the content, right? They might care about the quality of the content, but they might not care as much about whether or not it's HD or like high quality images, right? What they care about is the quality of the conversation, the quality of the content, the quality of the community, right? Because that is actually the thing that will drive the growth of this and enable you to be able to build a business around it. So I definitely think that it is important to care about the technical things so that the people have a great experience. I think you want your community to speak about those things, how great it is to listen to this, how good the music might be in your intro, and how the experience of actually listening or watching now more popularly your podcast actually is, and how, those things sort of create a safe space for that person. So while they're driving, while they're at work, while they're studying, while they're cooking, they can go into a different world where they experience and can be part of this community that you've tried to build for them.
Sure, that's really, really insightful. But I mean, on the back of everything we've spoken about, right, do you have any tips for aspiring podcasters, I mean, regarding the technical aspects of podcasting?
Yeah, I think it's very important that you care about the audio a lot more. I think podcasting as a medium started mainly around audio, right? And it was really about you being able to create an audio experience for the people that that were listening. And that starts with just the intro that you have, the music that you play, the copy that you write, and the things that you say in the beginning that just get people locked in and immerse themselves in the content that you're about to share. And then it goes into the quality of the actual audio itself. When I started out recording on my phone in coffee shops because I thought, oh man, this would be cool because people will feel like they're part of a conversation. I didn't realize how noisy coffee shops were. But like, as we evolve now, it's like, oh wait, you can get very affordable means to be able to record, edit, and publish a podcast with much higher quality without necessarily needing to, break the bank. I do think now the great thing is, AI has started to come into a lot of the technology for creators where you can use AI and AI tools in order to improve the sound quality of something that was recorded in a noisy area. And you use those tools just to improve the experience, even if it's just a little bit. What happens is the person at the other end starts to think, oh man, this is very professional. This is a good experience for me to go through. So you want to, go as far as you possibly can in terms of the resources that you have to provide a really great experience. So if you can record on your phone, definitely do it in your room, covered in pillows, and you can do it very quietly, or, you purchased your first microphone, which is what I did, which is like a microphone. I think it was about 700 Rand. You plug it straight into your phone and you speak directly into the microphone. And you're seeing a lot more of this technology come in where, the microphones are getting way cheaper. The recording, everything you need to record a podcast is becoming a lot more affordable. But then just couple that with really great resources from an editing point where you improve the sound quality, you build a really great experience that helps people immerse themselves in the content that you're making.
So what then would you say are some of the challenges faced by podcasters when they start?
Obviously, I think the biggest one is always going to be, the resources to be able to do this. You're talking about equipment to be able to record, software to be able to edit, and even, platforms to be able to publish and distribute this content. All these things are resources that someone will need to be able to do these things. If you can, I think it's always helpful to try and research as much as possible to find tools where these things become way less expensive and way less costly. So from a resource perspective, I think it's definitely heavy on that end. But I think the bigger thing and more important thing now is I think podcasters aren't necessarily starting with the community in mind, with the problem-solving thinking in mind, the empowerment thinking in mind. This medium started to bring communities together to gather and be able to engage meaningfully around topics that they care about. The more close that you are to that truth, the better the chances that you will be able to find your community and be able to build for them. So I do think that element is the more challenging thing, where someone thinks, oh man, when I'm chilling with my friends, we have really great conversations. Let's start a podcast. No, don't do that. Don't do that. Definitely scrutinize whether or not there's value in the thing that you're trying to do, the conversations you're trying to have, the community you're trying to build, because those things make it a lot easier and better for you to be able to chart a journey, for you to monetize, for you to be able to scale, for you to be able to build a business around this thing that you really care about.
I mean, on the backdrop of some of the theme notes that come up is we're building value, building audience, refining audience. How then do you think we can measure, as a podcaster, how then do I measure the success of my podcast?
Yeah. I'm going to say community so much, Shim. Again, I think it's the growth of your community. I think it's very easy to get caught up in vanity metrics where you're going, our clips don't go viral.
Yeah.
Our podcast is not trending. People aren't talking about it on Twitter. It's like, no. Is your community growing? And that has always been my North Star, is how many entrepreneurs, small businesses, and creators are able to start or build things that they care about better and more efficiently because they've listened to episodes of the podcast. If people are not being empowered, I'm not doing my job. That's how I think about it. I think everyone needs to define a clear North Star for themselves and say, this is the thing why we want to create this podcast. And if that North Star is a vanity metric like listenership or trending on TikTok or trending on Twitter, what ends up happening is when the cycle where, I think social media moves in cycles, and today you might be the hottest thing in town, tomorrow people might not care about you. If your North Star as a podcast is listenership or virality, you are going to be depressed when the cycle moves on and people move on to the next new thing. So if your North Star is a clear thing around empowerment, education, enabling other people to build, then you have a very clear thing where you can go, okay, is our community growing? Are the people that listen to this podcast actually building things? Are the people listening to this podcast growing their businesses? Are the people listening to this podcast actually evolving in their careers to go to the next level? And that's how I define the success of podcasts for me.
And I love how you mentioned, not being entrapped in vanity matrix, but also in creating your podcast and product, you also want to stand out. Yeah. So how can I, with so many podcasts that are around, or rather out there in the market, ensure that I still stand out and attract my community?
Yeah, I think, the creator journey, because I think podcasts are sort of roped into that creator box. The creator journey is very similar to the startup journey or a small business journey. You really need to think about what differentiates what you're doing from everyone else. There are hundreds and thousands of podcasts, and they all exist competing for the attention of people in the community that you want to build. what is it about the thing that you are creating that makes someone else so much better off once they leave that interaction with you? So if I, have never heard your podcast ever in my life and I listen to it, will I be changed? Will I be thinking differently? Will I see things differently? Will I be educated around something, Because if there's value, then you'll be successful, right? So I do think, think like a startup when you're creating your podcast. What problem are you really solving? Who are you solving that problem for? And will there be enough people to solve that problem for that will actually enable this to be a sustainable business, for example? So I do think, those are the things I think about when I think about that. Yeah.
And then, how does one go about, really just infusing podcasting, their podcasting life, and balancing that out with other aspects of their life?
That's an interesting one.
It's the balancing question yet again.
Yeah, I think, I don't think podcasts are all in or nothing. Yeah. Very much similarly to business or anything else. You really just need to be very dedicated to delivering the value that you promised to your community at the very beginning and trying to make sure that what you're delivering actually has value, solves a problem for people, and helps people come together in a very meaningful way. And just going back to the last question, what will separate you will always be the values that you have for the community that you are trying to build. And that North Star that you are pointing at is the thing that's going to drive whether or not you're willing to do this for a very long time. There's a stat actually on Nielsen reports, which primarily, documents the growth of different media platforms. And in podcasts specifically, around 1 in 4 podcasts that has ever existed actually still exists today. The other 4 are gone. So it's 1 in 5 podcasts still exists. The other 4 are gone. Why? Because people start a podcast today and they are surprised when 10,000 people don't listen. It's like, no, that's not how this is going to go. There's a journey, right? So if you at the beginning are looking at the wrong North Star and the vanity metrics come to you and you completely collapse because you don't understand why millions and millions of people don't know about you or care about what you're trying to do, then it's going to be difficult, right? So that balancing thing for me is always around like the motivation that you have, but also just like being very, very, very systematic in your approach, right? I think creative industries can sometimes feel a lot more, relaxed, like, we can publish when we need to or whatever it is. But if you, for example, make a commitment that you're going to, release a podcast every month, what does that journey look like to make sure that you don't have to struggle to be able to do that and keep the podcast going for as long as possible so that it can finally reach the people it needs at the time at which they actually, engage with it?
Sure. My big takeaway from everything you've said is, build meaningful things that would outlive you, but make them about the audience and build a community to go along with you. But before I say thank you and let you go, lastly, I'm watching this and I'm thinking to myself, man, I'd really like to start, or I've started, right, and I still have jitters. What advice do you have?
I would say keep going. My big song that I play every day, it's my hit song.
Yeah.
It's just keep building.
Nice.
Right? And the reason I say just keep building is because you don't know how long you'll need to do this for it to work. And if you are resilient and you are persistent, you'll outlive and out-survive the people that don't have that energy. If you have the clear North Star to be able to build a meaningful thing that you deeply care about, what happens is you are powered by a different energy. And because of that energy, you'll be able to, sustain yourself a lot longer and be able to dedicate yourself a lot longer than other people would, right? So just keep building. Keep publishing the content. Try it on different platforms. Put it on video. Put it on TikTok. Put it on Instagram. Try different platforms, different formats, because trying different things, what happens is you start to figure things out and you start to learn how to actually make it impactful, how to make it a lot more valuable, how to make sure that it's a lot more empowering as well. The more you serve your community, the more that community will show up for you. And I think if you just keep building and you're building with the right values in place, success will always come.
Sure, man. I wish we had a mic. pin drop, but we can't really do that. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much,
man. Remember, whether you're starting out or looking into refining your existing podcast, consistency, authenticity, and a clear vision are key. Take these tips to heart and don't be afraid to experiment and innovate in your podcasting journey. Thank you for tuning in to the Telkom Business Blaze Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback, so feel free to reach out on our social media channels. I'm Bulelani Balabala. Thank you for tuning in.